Her grandson mocked her trembling hand and laughed when she couldn't sign her name. Irene Whitaker, retired teacher and widow, didn't flinch. Jacob had been managing her finances until she opened the books. By sundown, his name was erased from her accounts, her deed, and her legacy. She'd taught children to read for 40 years. Now she was correcting her own family, and when he came to collect what he thought was his, he found a lesson instead. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The morning light slanted across Irene Whitaker's kitchen table, catching the edge of a half-written greeting card. The paper trembled faintly beneath her hand, not from the air vent humming nearby, but from the soft, betraying shake that had become her unwanted signature. The pen hovered above the line where she meant to write, "Love, Grandma Irene." She drew a breath, willing the muscles to steady, the same way she'd once calmed a room of restless sixth graders. Her knuckles obeyed, almost. The letters were crooked but legible. She sat back, satisfied in quiet defiance of her own body. Then Jacob's voice floated in from the hallway. Casual, grating. "Want me to sign it for you, Grandma?" He didn't even look up from his phone as he passed behind her chair. His tone carried that performative kindness, the kind that came wrapped in mockery. Before Irene could respond, Mallory's laugh followed like an echo. "It'd be faster," she said, eyes glinting as she set down her travel mug on the counter. Irene kept her gaze on the card. She set the pen down slowly, aligning it perfectly beside the envelope. Her pulse stayed calm, but something behind her ribs turned to glass. "I've been writing my own name for 70 years, she said softly. "I'll manage." Jacob smirked, half amused, half bored. "Just trying to help." "Of course," Irene replied. Her voice had the practiced gentleness that once tamed rowdy children, and now shielded her from adults who should have known better. He shrugged and wandered out the door, Mallory trailing after him, still checking her reflection in her phone screen. The sound of their laughter faded down the porch steps, replaced by the hollow quiet of the house. Irene stayed seated, the ticking clock filling the silence. On the table sat a row of cards. Birthdays, anniversaries, condolence notes. Each one a small promise she still kept, even when her body fought her for it. She reached for the pen again, her fingers slow but deliberate, and finished her signature in careful, deliberate strokes. By the time Cleo Martin knocked that afternoon, the house had regained its order. Dishes cleaned, card mailed, everything in its place. But Cleo had known Irene for 60 years, and she could read quiet like a headline. "What's wrong, honey?" Cleo asked, stepping in without waiting for an answer. Brought the smell of lilac perfume and cool October air. "Nothing," Irene said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Just tired." Cleo eyed her. "Tired doesn't make you this quiet. You look like you swallowed a lemon and tried to smile through it." That pulled a small laugh from Irene, but her eyes stayed distant. "Do you ever feel like people see you as a relic, not a person?" Cleo snorted. "Every Sunday at church?" They sat down at the table, the afternoon light softening around them. Irene poured tea, her hand steady now, as if anger, once buried deep enough, could lend her strength. Cleo noticed. "Your tremor's better," she said. Irene's mouth curved faintly. "It comes and goes." They talked of small things for a while. Cleo's garden, the neighbor's new fence, the weather turning. But beneath the surface of every word, Irene's thoughts returned to the moment at the table. The look in Jacob's eyes, the amused cruelty. It wasn't the first time he'd spoken that way, but it was the first time she'd felt the heat of shame follow it, a feeling she refused to allow in her own home. As dusk gathered outside, Cleo rose to leave. She paused by the door. "Don't let that boy talk to you like you're fading," she said, voice firm. I won't, Irene promised. When the house was quiet again, Irene returned to the table. The pen still lay there, catching the lamplight. She picked it up, running her thumb along its barrel. A plain silver pen, weighty and cool in her hand. The tremor had vanished entirely. She set it upright in the cup beside her stack of checkbooks, her gaze steady. The clock ticked once, twice. Then she whispered, "Not to anyone. We'll see who signs for whom." The next morning, the house felt different. Too still, like it was waiting for something to be unearthed. The kitchen carried the faint smell of yesterday's tea, and on the table, Irene's pen gleamed faintly in the early light. She stood a moment, watching the dust drift through the beams of sun, then turned toward the small office at the end of the hall. The room was more memory than space. Lace curtains, a maple desk worn smooth at the edges, the scent of old paper and lavender furniture polish. Irene eased open the top drawer and drew out a stack of her old check registers, the covers creased and soft from years of careful balancing. She sat down, pulled on her reading glasses, and opened one at random. April, 2 years ago. The handwriting marched neatly down the columns. Grocery totals, donations to the library, Sunday lunches at the diner with Cleo. Every line matched her own rhythm, her own memory. Then she opened the folder Jacob had set up when he helped her move everything online. The printouts looked sterile, detached. Strings of numbers, coded notes, and withdrawals that didn't match her pen. A $50 debit from an electronics store. 2 small Amazon orders she didn't remember placing, and a $600 transfer tagged home repair. Her lips thinned. There hadn't been a single repair since Jacob took over. She went line by line, tracing each discrepancy with her fingertip. Her hand trembled only once, and even then it was the kind of tremor born of cold realization, not weakness. By the time she reached the last page, the afternoon light had shifted toward gold. Irene stacked the papers neatly, her mind whirring with a quiet, methodical anger. Not the kind that flared, the kind that simmered, slow and patient, until it could be shaped into precision. She reached for the phone, dialed the number printed on the corner of the statement, and asked for the branch manager. "Carmen Ruiz, this is she," a warm voice answered. "Ms. Ruiz," Irene said evenly, "I'd like to come in to discuss some account irregularities, privately, if possible." "Of course, Mrs. Whitaker," Carmen replied. "Would tomorrow morning work?" "Today," Irene said. "I'll be there in 30 minutes." The branch sat on a quiet corner near the post office, small enough that the tellers knew most faces by name. Irene stepped through the glass doors, the scent of coffee and printer toner hanging in the air. A few customers waited in line. The low murmur of transactions filled the space. Carmen emerged from her office, short, sharp-eyed, with her dark hair pinned neatly back. "Mrs. Whitaker," she greeted, offering a genuine smile. "Let's talk in here." The door shut softly behind them. Carmen gestured toward the chair opposite her desk. "You mentioned irregularities?" Irene handed over the stack of papers. Her handwritten registers on top, Jacob's digital printouts beneath. "I believe someone's been using my account for personal expenses," she said. "Someone with access, I granted." Carmen began to flip through the records, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. "These older entries? These are yours?" "Yes." "And these online transfers? They're linked to an external account. Do you recognize the last 4 digits?" Irene didn't look. "I don't have to." The banker's fingers hesitated on the paper. "Some of these transfers weren't authorized by you?" Irene met her eyes, clear, unwavering. "Not by me." Silence hung in the room. The hum of the air conditioner filled the pause. Carmen nodded slowly, professionalism giving way to something more personal. "We can flag these for review, but I'd like you to consider freezing external access. That will cut off whoever's making them. That's exactly what I want, Irene said. Carmen hesitated. Do you mind me asking, who had access? My grandson. The words left her mouth steady, but the echo of them stung. Carmen's expression softened. I see. Irene straightened, the poise of a lifetime settling back over her like a pressed blouse. I'd appreciate it if this conversation stayed between us for now. Of course, Carmen said firmly. You'll get a confirmation once the restriction is active. Outside, the wind had picked up. The Tennessee sky hung low and heavy, threatening rain. Irene paused by the sidewalk, papers tucked under her arm. Her reflection in the glass door looked older than she remembered. Smaller, too. But her eyes still had that schoolteacher's steadiness. She thought of Jacob's smirk, his easy laughter, his hand on her shoulder as he'd told her not to worry about the grown-up stuff. Now she understood exactly how grown-up this would become. As she waited for the bus, Irene folded the statement in half, creasing it cleanly down the middle. A storm rumbled in the distance, soft, promising. She slipped the paper into her coat pocket and whispered to herself, Lesson 1. Never mock the hands that built your future. The first drops of rain hit her wrist, cool and sharp, as the bus doors opened with a hiss. She stepped inside, eyes forward, already planning her next move. The morning broke gray and wind-shaken, clouds pressing low over Chattanooga like an unspoken warning. Irene stood at the bus stop near Missionary Ridge, her umbrella tucked under one arm, her handbag clasped tight. The concrete was slick with the night's rain, and the street smelled faintly of wet leaves and car exhaust. She checked her watch. The old gold one Henry had given her the Christmas before he passed. It ticked faithfully, each second a small reminder that time moved forward, whether you were ready or not. The bus wheezed to a stop in front of her, door swinging open with a hiss. The driver nodded. Morning, ma'am. Morning, she replied, stepping up carefully. The warm air inside smelled of rubber and coffee. She took a seat near the front, the papers in her bag pressing against her side. The flagged statements Carmen had printed, proof that her trust had been stolen in small, quiet bites. Through the window, the city slid past. Red brick storefronts, an old barber shop, a mural fading on the side of a bakery. She'd taught half the children whose names had once been painted there. When the bus crossed into downtown, Irene straightened. She pressed the bell and felt the slow lurch of the stop. The law office stood 3 blocks away, a narrow, dignified building of sandstone and brass fixtures. The sign beside the door read, Hayes and Lyle, Attorneys at Law. She paused on the steps, gathering herself. The wind tugged at her coat. Inside, the reception smelled faintly of lemon polish and ink. The young woman at the desk looked up. Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker. Mr. Hayes is expecting you. Of course he was. Victor Hayes had drawn up her first will, helped settle her husband's estate, and filed the paperwork when she'd sold the family car. He'd seen her through grief, through taxes, through the small bureaucratic indignities of aging, all with that same patient steadiness that never patronized. When she entered his office, Victor rose from behind a heavy oak desk, his silver hair neatly combed, glasses low on his nose. Irene, he said warmly, extending both hands. It's good to see you, though I have a feeling this isn't a social visit. It isn't, she replied. He gestured for her to sit. Tell me everything. Irene opened her bag and placed the folder between them. Her movements were precise, deliberate. She explained the missing money, the fake transfers, the way Jacob had set up online convenience, after convincing her it was the modern thing to do. As she spoke, Victor's expression changed, warmth fading to a controlled, professional stillness. By the time she finished, his fingers were steepled beneath his chin. This, he said finally, is financial elder abuse. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Irene nodded once. I thought as much. Victor leaned back in his chair. The good news is, you caught it early. The law's clear on this sort of thing, but timing matters. We'll start by revoking any power of attorney, if you've granted one. I have, she said quietly. Jacob insisted I needed help keeping up. Victor's jaw tightened. Then that's our first step. We'll file a limited revocation and create a new designation in your name alone. I'll draft the documents right now. He opened a file drawer and pulled out the necessary forms, the paper crisp and waiting. The sound of his pen scratching filled the office, the kind of steady, competent noise Irene had always loved. When he turned the pages toward her, Irene slipped on her glasses. The print blurred slightly at the edges, but the meaning was clear enough. Her name, her authority, her right to her own life. Take your time, Victor said gently. She held the pen between her fingers, the same silver barrel that Jacob had mocked days before. Her hand trembled, a small defiance of muscle and age. But the tremor didn't stop her. If anything, it made each stroke more deliberate, every letter a small act of reclamation. By the time she signed the last page, her signature had steadied itself. Victor gathered the documents, sliding them into a folder embossed with his firm's name. This is the beginning, he said. Once this is filed, Jacob won't have access to anything you don't allow. But Irene, this might get messy. She met his eyes. It's already messy. I'm just cleaning it up. A flicker of admiration crossed his face. You always were my favorite client. She allowed herself a thin smile. I'll hold you to that discount you promised me back in 2002. He laughed softly. Still sharp. She stood, smoothing the front of her coat. Sharper than he thinks. As she reached the door, Victor called after her. I'll have the paperwork couriered to the county by evening. You'll get a confirmation tomorrow. Thank you, Victor. When she stepped back into the chill air, the sky had darkened, that heavy kind of gray before rain breaks loose. She walked to the bus stop slowly, but each step felt sure, decisive. Across the street, a jewelry shop window reflected her faintly, an older woman in a tan coat, holding a folder like a shield. She didn't look frail, she looked ready. The wind picked up, lifting her hair just enough to brush her cheek. From somewhere deep inside her coat pocket, she felt the weight of her pen, that small, silver promise. She closed her fingers around it and whispered, Let's see him try to sign anything now. The first crack of thunder rolled low and distant, as if the world had just agreed. The next morning dawned bright but cold, that sharp Tennessee chill that made every breath feel thin and electric. Irene stood at the kitchen counter, waiting for her kettle to sing, a manila folder already resting beside her cup. Inside it lay her will, the one she and Victor had drafted years ago, when Jacob was still a lanky teenager who'd mowed her lawn for $10 and lemonade. She remembered how proud he'd looked the day she told him, One day, this house will be yours. Now, she couldn't think of that promise without tasting metal. Steam rose from the kettle, curling against the light. She poured the water, set down the cup untouched, and pressed her palm flat against the folder. Her hand trembled faintly, but this time it wasn't weakness. It was resolve, pushing its way through flesh and bone. Victor Hayes's office smelled of coffee and printer ink again when she arrived. Carmen's emails had already confirmed the account freezes, but Irene wasn't finished yet. Not even close. Morning, Mrs. Whitaker, the receptionist greeted. Mr. Hayes said to send you right in. Victor was standing at the window, jacket off, sleeves rolled up. He turned when she entered, smiling gently. You don't waste time. Time's not something I have to waste, she replied, closing the door behind her. He gestured toward a chair. What have you brought me today? Her voice was calm, almost teacher-like as she placed the folder on his desk. My will. It needs amending. He sat down, flipping through the pages. Everything's still current, he said, scanning quickly. House? Savings? The small investment account? All of it goes to your grandson, correct? Yes. Victor looked up. Do you want him out completely? The question hovered between them, heavy as the air before a storm. Irene drew the silver pen from her bag, the same one Jacob had mocked. She set it on the desk like a statement. With the same pen he laughed at, she said quietly, I want his name gone. Victor didn't argue, didn't soften it with platitudes. He simply nodded and pulled a new document from his drawer. We'll start fresh. Who would you like as your new beneficiary? She hesitated for the first time. Then her eyes moved to the bookshelf behind him, rows of law journals, dictionaries, and in the middle, a framed photo of Victor shaking hands with a group of smiling children outside a public library. The reading initiative, she said suddenly, the one downtown, the program for the kids who can't afford their own books. Victor blinked, surprised but pleased. That's a wonderful cause. Are you sure? I spent 40 years teaching children to read, Irene said. If my savings can teach a few more, I'll consider it a better legacy than a boat or a down payment for someone ungrateful. He gave a slow, respectful nod and began typing. The sound of his fingers on the keyboard filled the office, rhythmic, almost soothing. When he turned the pages toward her this time, the language looked familiar. The same legal phrases and clauses. But it all meant something entirely new. A clean ledger, a second chance. She picked up the pen. Her hand trembled at first, but as she began to write her name, the tremor quieted, as if even her body recognized this moment as sacred. Each loop of her signature seemed to erase a piece of Jacob's claim, the entitlement, the smirk, the condescension. Line by line, she rewrote the future. When it was done, she laid the pen down, exhaling through her nose. There, she said softly. That's one lesson he won't forget. Victor added his own signature as witness, sealing it with the steady press of his notary stamp. You've done the right thing, Irene, he said. I'll have this filed immediately. By this afternoon, it'll be official. She nodded, watching him slide the papers into a labeled envelope. It feels lighter already, she murmured. Victor smiled faintly. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment, it's about correction. Irene rose from her chair, gathering her purse. Sometimes, she said, it's both. Outside, the city hummed with midday life, buses groaning, traffic lights clicking through their patterns. She walked to the corner where the wind tugged at her coat, her reflection flashing briefly in a storefront window. She looked calm, composed. But beneath that composure, something old and fierce had awakened. As she waited for the bus, her phone buzzed. A text from Jacob. Hey, Grandma, hope you're doing okay. Need to talk about your account later. She stared at the screen, then slipped the phone back into her pocket without replying. The bus pulled up with its familiar hiss, and she stepped on, silver pen still in her hand. By the time she found her seat, she'd made up her mind. She wasn't just erasing his name from a document, she was erasing it from her life. The bus rumbled forward, and Irene looked out the window at the courthouse in the distance. Tomorrow, he'd discover what it meant to underestimate a woman with a steady hand. The knock came, mid-afternoon, sharp and self-assured. Irene had been expecting it. She'd known Jacob long enough to recognize the rhythm of entitlement in every sound he made. She set her teacup down, smoothed the front of her sweater, and walked to the door with unhurried steps. When she opened it, Jacob was standing there with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Mallory was beside him, perfume strong enough to announce her before she spoke. Hey, Grandma, Jacob said, leaning one arm on the doorframe. Thought we'd stop by and check on you. See how things are going. I'm just fine, Irene said evenly. Come in, if you must. Mallory smiled thinly, her eyes already roving around the entryway. Such a charming place. Has that vintage feel, doesn't it? It's been well lived in, Irene said, motioning toward the sitting room. Jacob followed, hands in his pockets, the swagger in his walk too big for the small cottage. He looked around as if cataloging what would soon belong to him: the old family photos, the antique clock, the houseplants she'd nursed longer than he'd been alive. "Still got that draft in the chimney?" he said, glancing toward the fireplace. "Once I get this place, I might finally fix it up. New floors? Maybe an open layout? Mallory wants a breakfast nook." Mallory ran a finger along the mantel. "It's got good bones," she said approvingly. Irene poured tea into 3 cups, the china clinking softly. "How thoughtful," she said. "Already making plans for something that isn't yours." Jacob chuckled. "Oh, come on, Grandma, it's all the same, isn't it? You said years ago—" "I know what I said," Irene interrupted gently, handing him a cup. "Things change." He smirked. "You don't mean that. I'm just trying to help keep everything in order. You know I've been managing your accounts, making sure the bills are paid." She stirred her own tea, the spoon gliding in slow, precise circles. "Yes," she said, "I'm aware." The clock on the mantel ticked, a soft metronome in the thickening air. Mallory sat on the edge of the couch, her posture polite but impatient. "We actually wanted to talk about the house, Mrs. Whitaker," she said. "Jacob and I were thinking, once we're married, it'd be easier for everyone if we moved in here. You could stay for a while, of course. Until—" She trailed off, realizing she'd stepped too far. "Until?" Irene asked mildly. "Until you're ready to, you know, downsize," Mallory finished, smiling as if the word had been harmless. Jacob cleared his throat. "What she means is, we could take care of the place for you. Keep it in the family." Irene rose from her chair. Her movements were slow but deliberate, each step echoing through the quiet room. She walked to her writing desk by the window and opened a drawer. The sound of paper sliding against wood made both of them glance up. When she turned back, a cause en masse, single envelope rested in her hand. Jacob frowned. "What's that?" "Something you'll want to read," Irene said. She placed it on the table beside his teacup. The seal bore Victor Hayes's embossed initials. Professional, undeniable. Jacob hesitated before opening it. The color drained slightly from his face as his eyes scanned the first page. His jaw tightened. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "It's a notice of revocation," Irene said calmly. "Effective immediately, you no longer have any power of attorney or access to my accounts, or my house." Mallory blinked. "You're joking." Irene met her gaze. "I'm not." Jacob dropped the letter onto the table, his voice rising. "You can't do this, Grandma. After everything I've done for you—" She cut him off with the same authority she'd once used in her classroom. "You mean, after everything you've taken, I trusted you. You mistook that for weakness." He took a step toward her, but she didn't move. The steady tick of the mantel clock filled the silence between them. "I'm giving you a chance to leave with what dignity you have left," Irene said quietly. "Don't waste it." For a moment, Jacob said nothing, his fists clenched, then released. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "Doubtful," Irene replied. Mallory tugged at his sleeve, whispering something under her breath. They turned toward the door, Jacob's shoulders tight with anger. The screen slammed behind them, rattling against the frame. When the sound faded, Irene exhaled slowly and returned to her chair. The tea had gone cold. She lifted the cup anyway and took a sip, savoring the quiet. On the table, the revoked notice sat between the 2 untouched cups, a paper barrier between what was hers and what would never be theirs again. Outside, the wind swept dry leaves across the porch, whispering through the cracks beneath the door. Irene set her cup down, her expression unreadable. Then, softly, almost to herself, she said, "Lesson 2. Never assume the meek don't keep records." The clock chimed once, sharp and certain, marking the hour her grandson's inheritance had just ended. Jacob's truck peeled away from the curb, its tires spitting gravel across the street. Irene watched from the front window, her expression still and unreadable, the faint hum of the engine fading into the quiet that followed. The curtains swayed in the draft he'd left behind, the air in the house charged, like the hush after a lightning strike. Mallory hadn't followed him. She lingered on the porch, arms crossed, her designer bag clutched like armor. Through the glass, Irene could see the confusion in the younger woman's face, the sudden recognition that the game had changed, and she was no longer holding the better cards. A moment later, there was a tentative knock. Irene opened the door just wide enough to look her in the eye. "This isn't fair," Mallory said, voice trembling with frustration. "He was just trying to help. You blindsided him." Irene's gaze didn't waver. Neither was stealing. Mallory blinked, her mouth tightening as though she wanted to argue but couldn't find the right words. "You've made a mistake," she managed. "No," Irene said softly. "I made a correction." The words hung there, sharp and final. Mallory stepped back, color rising in her cheeks. "You'll regret this," she said, but it lacked Jacob's heat, sounded more like an echo of his threats than her own conviction. "I already did," Irene replied, and closed the door gently. By evening, the house had settled again, but it felt different, lighter somehow. The tension that had crept through its walls for months was gone, leaving only the faint scent of dust and tea. Irene turned on the radio, soft jazz from a local station, and sat at her writing desk. A knock came again, but this time it was familiar. 2 short taps, 1 long. Cleo. She let herself in, carrying a cardboard box under one arm. "Heard the storm pass through," she said dryly. Irene arched an eyebrow. "If you mean Jacob, yes, though I'm not sure the weather will recover." Cleo set the box on the table. "You really did it, didn't you?" "I did." "Good." Cleo rubbed her hands together. "Now let's get the rest of your things in order before that boy finds another crack to slither through." They spent the next hour sorting through drawers and files, insurance papers, old bank statements, copies of documents Irene had kept in triplicate because she never trusted a single sheet of paper to hold her life. The sound of rustling envelopes and the faint creak of floorboards filled the room, punctuated by Cleo's occasional muttering about good-for-nothing descendants. At one point, Cleo looked up. "You don't seem shaken." "I'm tired," Irene admitted, tying a bundle of papers with twine, "but not afraid. That's new." Cleo smiled faintly. "You wear calm like armor." Irene didn't disagree. Later, when the last box was labeled and tucked neatly beside her desk, Irene picked up the phone and dialed Victor Hayes. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Whitaker, I was just about to call you. I've got confirmation from the clerk's office. All documents are processed and recorded. Power of attorney revoked. Will officially amended." "Thank you, Victor," she said. "One more thing," he added. "You should notify your bank to file a fraud alert just as a safeguard. It'll flag any attempt to use your accounts without authorization." "I was planning to," she said, glancing at the silver pen resting beside her tea. "I'll handle it tonight." "I'll sleep better knowing you've got everything locked down," Victor said, a smile in his voice. "And Irene, you did the right thing." When she hung up, the quiet felt earned. At her desk, Irene opened her laptop and logged into the bank portal Carmen had helped her set up. The interface felt less foreign now, the numbers clearer. She clicked through to the security section, fingers steady on the keyboard. Each confirmation box brought a small flicker of satisfaction. Fraud alert filed. External transfers blocked. Alerts sent directly to her. She leaned back, letting the glow of the screen light her face. For the first time in months, control was entirely hers. Through the open window came the faint sound of Jacob's truck somewhere in the distance, a familiar growl fading into nothing. Cleo reappeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. All squared away? Almost, Irene said. Just one last click. She pressed the final confirmation, the sound of it soft and decisive. Now it's done. Cleo smiled. Good. Let him rage. There's not a lock in this house he can break anymore. Irene closed the laptop, her reflection faint in the black screen. He'll try, she said quietly, but from now on, he won't even see where the doors are. Outside, thunder rumbled again, distant but approaching. The two women stood in the lamplight, surrounded by neat stacks of boxes and the faint smell of rain. Cleo reached for her coat. What's next? Irene looked toward the dark window, her hand resting on the silver pen. Next, she said, we wait for him to realize just how little control he ever had. The storm broke then, rain against the windows, steady and unrelenting, as if the sky itself was finally washing him out of her life. The storm had moved on by morning, leaving behind air that smelled like wet soil and renewal. Irene sat at her kitchen table, sorting through the last of the papers she and Cleo had boxed the night before. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned. Her tea had just begun to cool when the phone rang. The sound was sharp, intrusive, too loud for the peaceful room. She glanced at the screen. Jacob. For a moment, she considered letting it ring out. Then she picked it up, thumb hovering just long enough to remind herself. This would be the last time she answered him. She pressed accept and set the phone on speaker. Grandma! Jacob's voice erupted immediately, already raised, already angry. What the hell is wrong with you? Irene's tone stayed level. Good morning, Jacob. Don't good morning me. You had no right to go behind my back. Changing things, cutting me off, freezing accounts. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've caused? Cleo appeared from the hallway, drawn by the volume. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching silently. Irene adjusted her glasses and reached for her tea. The only trouble I've caused, she said, is the kind that comes from taking back what was mine. You don't understand how any of this works, Jacob shouted. I was managing things for you. You're making it harder for me to help. Irene set the cup down with deliberate care. You weren't helping, Jacob. You were helping yourself. Unbelievable, he snapped. After everything I've done. Cleo rolled her eyes from the kitchen doorway. Here it comes, she muttered under her breath. Jacob didn't hear her. He was still building momentum, the words spilling fast and jagged. You're treating me like a criminal over a few stupid transactions. You're not even in your right mind anymore, Grandma. You don't know what you're doing. Irene's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained soft. I'm more certain of my decisions now than I've ever been. Do you even realize how this makes me look? The bank called me. They froze the accounts. I've got people thinking I stole from my own grandmother. You did, Irene said simply. That stopped him for half a beat. The silence that followed was thick and electric. Then he barked a humorless laugh. You're being manipulated. That old lawyer of yours, what's his name, Hayes? He's using you. You think these people care about you? They just want your money. Cleo moved to the table and poured herself coffee, her expression a blend of amusement and disgust. Projection, she said dryly. Jacob kept going, louder now. This isn't respect, Grandma. You're disrespecting the family. You're embarrassing me. Irene glanced at Cleo, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Jacob, she said evenly, you're not entitled to anything I built. Not my home, not my savings, not my peace. You're bitter, he spat. That's all you are, a bitter old woman trying to punish me for being successful. Cleo let out a low whistle. Oh, he's really got a nerve. Irene didn't flinch. You mistake boundaries for bitterness. That's your problem. Jacob's breathing came fast through the speaker, his anger too big to contain. "You'll regret this," he said finally, his voice low and shaking. "You always said family comes first. Guess that was a lie." "Family does come first," she said, "when they behave like family." He didn't answer. The silence stretched just long enough for Irene to picture him, pacing, red-faced, searching for control he'd already lost. Then the line went dead. Cleo sipped her coffee. "Well?" she said. "He took that well?" Irene allowed herself a small, humorless laugh. "He never learned to lose. He gracefully." She reached for a notepad and jotted something down. "Block Jacob's number." The handwriting wobbled slightly, but each letter was legible, deliberate. Like every choice she'd made these past few days. When she finished, she tore the page neatly and set it beside the phone. "There," she said quietly. "No more noise." Cleo leaned on the counter. "You think he'll back off?" Irene looked out the window where the sun was breaking through the thinning clouds, light pooling across her garden. "No," she said, "but now he'll have to yell at a wall." They shared a long silence, the kind that said more than comfort ever could. Then the phone buzzed again. A notification, not a call. Irene checked it. Unknown transaction attempt. Declined. A small knowing smile touched her lips. She slid the phone away and turned to Cleo. "Lesson 3, she said. "When you stop answering, people show you exactly how much power they never had." The light outside shifted, bright, certain, unyielding. As Irene rose from the table and began clearing the cups, her hands steady, her shoulders square. The letter from Victor arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked neatly between an electricity bill and a grocery flyer. Irene recognized his tidy handwriting even before she slit the envelope open with her letter opener. Inside was a short note, and a single line underlined twice. "Jacob's attorney has requested a settlement meeting. Optional, but I think you'll want to be there." Irene read it twice, then set it aside beside her cup of tea. Optional. That word rolled through her head like a dare. She looked toward the silver pen resting in its stand, the one that had witnessed every correction she'd made to her life these past weeks. Optional or not, she was going. Victor met her in the lobby of his firm the next afternoon, his expression somewhere between concern and quiet pride. "You don't have to do this," he reminded her. "You've already won, legally speaking. Anything they want now is just noise." "I know," she said, fastening the clasp of her purse. "But I taught 6th grade for 40 years. I've learned there's value in watching someone read the consequences of their own actions out loud." He smiled at that. "Then let's make it short." They took the elevator up to the conference floor, its mirrored walls reflecting Irene's calm, steady posture. Her hair was pinned neatly, her cardigan buttoned just so. She looked like someone showing up to grade a final paper, not to negotiate. When the doors opened, Jacob was already inside. He sat at the polished walnut table, suit slightly too tight at the shoulders, his charm arranged across his face like a mask. Next to him was a young man in a navy blazer, his lawyer, scrolling through a laptop, all smooth efficiency and corporate courtesy. "Grandma," Jacob said with a practiced smile, standing halfway before sitting, again. "You look good. I'm glad you came." "Victor said it was optional," Irene replied, taking the seat opposite him. "I like to keep my appointments brief." His grin faltered. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitaker, Mr. Whitaker asked to arrange this meeting in hopes of finding a mutually agreeable solution. There seems to have been some confusion regarding account management." "Confusion?" Irene echoed, voice dry. Victor folded his hands, letting the silence stretch. "Mrs. Whitaker isn't confused," he said, "but go on." Jacob leaned forward, tone shifting to that old honeyed charm. "Look, Grandma, I know things got messy. Maybe I handled some things wrong, but this freezing me out entirely. It's not right. I just think we should sit down, talk it through. No lawyers, no hostility. You brought a lawyer, Irene said. Jacob hesitated. That's, well, that's just formality. Of course. She reached into her bag and withdrew a folder. Cream-colored, neat, secured with a metal clasp. She placed it in front of her, aligned perfectly with the table's edge. Then let's be formal. Jacob's lawyer reached for it automatically. May I? Please. He opened it and began scanning the first few pages. Transaction records, withdrawal slips, screenshots from her bank portal, the revocation documents with official stamps, notarized and dated. His fingers slowed as he flipped through, eyes darting between figures and signatures. By the time he reached the last page, a letter from Carmen Ruiz confirming fraudulent activity had been reported. He stopped reading altogether. His face shifted from polite neutrality to visible discomfort. He cleared his throat. Mr. Whitaker, perhaps we should... But Jacob interrupted, voice sharp. What is this supposed to prove? Victor leaned back slightly. It proves you were careless enough to think no one was watching. Jacob's jaw tightened. You don't know the full story. Irene stood then, smoothing the front of her cardigan. I do, she said, and so does the state. Everything in that folder is filed and recorded. Jacob looked up at her, color rising in his cheeks. You're really going to ruin your own family over money? Irene looked down at him for a long, steady moment. No, she said. I'm saving it from ruin. The lawyer tried to intervene. Mrs. Whitaker, there's no need to escalate. Irene turned her gaze toward him, calm but piercing. I didn't come here to escalate, Mr. Reynolds, he supplied quickly. Mr. Reynolds, she continued, I came here to make sure there are no misunderstandings left. She picked up her folder, tucked it neatly under her arm, and looked back at Jacob. This meeting is over. Victor rose behind her, a quiet shadow of support. Jacob stood too, his voice cracking between anger and disbelief. You think you've won, Grandma? You can't erase me that easily. Irene paused at the doorway, turning just enough to meet his glare. You're right, she said softly. You did that yourself. Then she left, the click of her shoes against the marble floor echoing like punctuation marks on the final line of a lesson long overdue. Outside, the late afternoon sun cut through the clouds, painting the street in gold. Victor fell into step beside her. You didn't have to say a word in there, he said. You let the paper do it for you. Irene smiled faintly, eyes forward. That's what good teachers do. They reached the curb just as a city bus rumbled past. Irene watched it disappear down the hill toward Missionary Ridge, her reflection flickering in its windows. Lesson 4, she murmured, mostly to herself. Sometimes silence is the loudest correction. Victor said nothing. He didn't need to. The courthouse clock struck 3, its chime rolling through the air. Steady, deliberate, final. And for the first time in months, Irene allowed herself to imagine peace, not as something lost, but as something she had reclaimed. The first sign of trouble didn't come from Jacob this time. It came from Mallory. Irene wouldn't have known about the video if Cleo hadn't shown up at her door the following morning, waving her phone like a scandal sheet. Don't you dare look at it, Cleo said, breathless with fury. You don't need to see what that tacky little brat put online. But Irene's curiosity was calm, unhurried. What kind of video? The kind that makes me want to throw this phone into traffic, Cleo snapped. She lowered her voice, her eyes softening with sympathy. She was mocking your hands, Irene. I won't repeat the words, but she filmed herself imitating your tremor, holding a teacup, shaking it, pretending she couldn't sign her name. For a moment, Irene just stood there, perfectly still. The morning light fell across her face, highlighting the fine lines of her composure. She didn't flinch. "How many people saw it?" she asked. Cleo scrolled briefly. "A few hundred, maybe. It's spreading, but folks are tearing her apart in the comments, even her co-workers from the look of it." Irene's jaw tightened once, then relaxed. "Good," she said. "Let them have their say." By evening, the video was gone, deleted after a flood of backlash. But not before it had found its way into screenshots, group chats, whispers. The damage was done, the kind that doesn't bruise but still leaves a mark. The next day, the phone rang again. This time it was Carmen Ruiz from the bank. "Mrs. Whitaker, I saw something online," Carmen said carefully. "I wanted to check in. We take harassment seriously, especially when it involves vulnerable clients." "I'm not vulnerable," Irene said, her voice even. "I know that," Carmen replied. "But this was cruel. If you'd like to pursue action, I can help you start a complaint. There are laws against this kind of public defamation." Irene looked out the window. Her garden glistened under a thin drizzle, the kind that soaked the soil quietly. "No, Carmen. I don't want to chase her in circles. She's not worth the ink." A pause. "Then what will you do?" Irene smiled faintly. "Something quieter." That afternoon, she sat at her desk with a legal pad and began to write. Not a complaint, but a letter. Her pen moved steadily, each word deliberate. She addressed it to the Chattanooga Chronicle, the city's small but earnest paper. She didn't sign her full name, only a retired teacher from Missionary Ridge. She wrote about financial exploitation, how easily it slips under the radar when disguised as help. She described dignity as something people try to take from the elderly in small, careless ways. A signature mocked, a savings account pilfered, a voice dismissed. She wrote until her hand cramped, then folded the pages neatly and mailed them before she could second-guess herself. The article appeared 3 days later in the Sunday Chronicle under the headline, "When Help Turns to Harm, One Senior's Quiet Fight for Independence." It wasn't long, but it was potent. The kind of piece people shared between sips of diner coffee or forwarded to their church email lists. It never mentioned Irene's name, but people who knew her could read between the lines. Cleo came over that morning with 2 copies. "You're famous," she teased. "Anonymous famous." Irene chuckled softly. "That's the best kind." Cleo scanned the last paragraph. "Sometimes dignity doesn't come from forgiveness, it comes from documentation." She grinned. "You even sound like yourself." "Maybe I was overdue for one last lesson plan," Irene said. They both laughed, but the sound didn't quite fill the room. Something in Irene's gut felt unsettled, like the air before a storm. Her phone buzzed just after noon. It was Carmen again, her voice quick and serious this time. "Mrs. Whitaker, I need to inform you about something," she said. "Jacob just tried to move funds from one of your accounts." Irene's hand stilled on her teacup. "That's impossible," she said. "Everything was closed and reissued." "I know," Carmen replied. "That's the strange part. The account he tried to access doesn't exist anymore. It was officially closed 2 weeks ago. The attempt flagged an internal alert." The words hung there, heavy and surreal. "So he tried to drain a ghost," Irene said quietly. "Yes, and it left a trail. Timestamps, IP address, everything. We're forwarding it to the authorities." Carmen hesitated, her tone softening. "I thought you should hear it from me first." Irene leaned back in her chair. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up, stirring the last leaves on the porch. "Thank you." "Carmen," she said, "you've been more vigilant than most." When she hung up, the silence in the house seemed alive, a low, humming satisfaction she hadn't expected to feel. Cleo was still at the table, sipping her tea. "What was that about?" Irene glanced at her, eyes sharp with quiet resolve. Let's just say Jacob's been trying to withdraw what doesn't belong to him. Cleo smirked. And what happened? He got nothing, Irene said, because there's nothing left for him to take. She rose, straightening her cardigan, her reflection steady in the kitchen window. Lesson 5, she murmured, almost to herself. Some people only learn when the door locks behind them. Outside, the wind slammed against the screen door. Not a storm this time, but a final warning. And for the first time since it all began, Irene didn't flinch. She simply let it close. The morning began with a quiet confidence. Irene woke to the steady rhythm of rain against the window, the kind that blurred the world but made her small kitchen feel like its own shelter. The storm outside had nothing left to do with her anymore. She moved with purpose. Tea steeping, toast browning, a list of errands written in her neat looping hand. By the time she settled at the table, her phone buzzed with a soft chime. A message from Carmen. Attempt confirmed. Account fully secured. Authorities notified. Irene read it once, then exhaled. Not relief. Something calmer than that. Closure. Across town, Carmen Ruiz stood at her desk in the bank's security office, headset on, tone measured. Yes, that's right, she said to the investigator on the line. The transfer request came from an external IP linked to Mr. Jacob Whitaker. Yes, Mrs. Whitaker's accounts were locked prior. The attempt failed instantly. She tapped a few keys, watching the cursor blink beside access denied, closed account. I'll send over the logs and signature comparisons, she added. No funds moved, not even a cent. When she hung up, she smiled faintly, the small, private kind that came from watching the right person win. Then she typed one final note in the file. Client protected. Subject exposed. Case pending escalation. That afternoon, Irene stood at her counter with her old recipe box open, flipping through the cards until she found the one she wanted, butterscotch pecan cookies. She hadn't baked them in years, but something about this moment called for a gesture that was both soft and final. She worked slowly, measuring flour and sugar, her movements steady and unhurried. When the first batch came out of the oven, the scent filled the whole house, warm, buttery, alive. By evening, a neat box of cookies tied with blue ribbon sat on the passenger seat of her car. She drove through the drizzle to the bank, parking in her usual spot under the flickering street lamp. Inside, Carmen looked up from her desk in surprise. Mrs. Whitaker, you didn't have to come out in this weather. Irene handed her the box. For you and your staff. It's my way of saying thank you. Carmen's face softened. You didn't have to. I know, Irene interrupted gently. But I wanted to. There aren't many people left who do their jobs with decency. You deserve cookies. Carmen laughed, then shook her head. Well, thank you. I'll make sure everyone knows what these stand for. I think they already do, Irene said. Later that night, Victor Hayes called. His voice was calm but firm. It's handled, he said. The bank's forwarding their report to local authorities. And I've gone ahead and filed for a no-contact order, just to be safe. Irene sat by the window, phone cradled between shoulder and ear, watching the lights of Missionary Ridge shimmer across the wet streets. Will it hold? It'll hold, Victor said. He can't touch your accounts, your property, or your peace of mind. If he tries, it'll be criminal. I'm not worried, she said, and meant it. Victor paused. You know, you've got a strength most people only talk about. You've turned something ugly into something dignified. Maybe, Irene said. Or maybe I just got tired of being polite. He chuckled softly. That's a better kind of strength. When they hung up, Irene closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet fill the house. No hum of anxiety, no ticking clock pressing against her nerves. Just peace. Solid. Earned. Deliberate. The email arrived close to midnight. The subject line was short. Congratulations. The sender, Jacob Whitaker. No hesitation this time. Irene didn't even click to preview it. Didn't want to see whatever venom he'd poured into the digital page. She hovered over the message, her fingers steady, and hit delete. The sound of the click was barely audible, but it might as well have been thunder. Then she opened her notepad, the same one where she'd written each lesson along the way, and added one more line beneath her tidy handwriting. Lesson 6. Silence is the cleanest revenge. She set down her pen and looked toward the darkened window. Beyond it, the rain had stopped, leaving the world slick and shining. The streetlights reflected in long, trembling streaks across the pavement, a mirror of her steady hands. For a moment she thought of her late husband, of all the lessons she'd taught in classrooms and kitchens. She wondered what he'd think of this version of her. Sharper, quieter, untouchable. Then she smiled, because for the first time, she didn't care what anyone thought. The phone buzzed once more, a notification from the security system confirming the deletion had been logged. Irene closed her eyes, whispering into the stillness. Nothing left for him to steal. And the house, old, proud, and safe again, seemed to exhale with her. It was a still Saturday morning, the kind that felt too quiet to trust. The sunlight lay pale across the porch boards, and Irene sat by the window, needle and thread in hand, mending a tear in her cardigan. The radio hummed low, an old jazz tune she used to grade papers to. Then came the knock. 3 light taps, evenly spaced. Polite, practiced. Irene looked up, her hand freezing mid-stitch. Through the thin curtain, she saw the faint shape of a woman standing on her porch. Tall, tidy, hair pulled into a sleek bun. A wicker basket rested on her arm, wrapped in plastic and ribbon. Even from here, Irene could sense the perfume. Too sweet, too forced. Mallory. Irene didn't move. The second knock came softer, followed by a sing-song voice. Mrs. Whitaker, it's Mallory. I just wanted to stop by for a minute. Irene kept her eyes on her hands. Slowly, she folded the sweater and set it aside. The voice continued, light, but rehearsed. I brought something for you. Just a little peace offering. I think things have been misunderstood. Cleo's car pulled up in front of the house just then, gravel crunching under the tires. She was out of the driver's seat before the engine cut off. Oh, for heaven's sake, she muttered, spotting Mallory on the porch. Cleo, Irene said quietly, without turning from the window. Don't engage. But Cleo was already halfway up the steps. What are you doing here? She demanded. You've got nerve showing up after what you and that boy pulled. Mallory turned, her smile stretching thinner. I just came to make amends. This doesn't have to stay ugly. Ugly is what you brought with you, Cleo shot back. Now take it and go. Irene stood, walking calmly to the front door but stopping short of touching the handle. Cleo, she said evenly, call the police. Cleo blinked. You sure? I'm sure. Mallory's smile faltered. Police? That's not necessary. I only wanted to talk. Talking time's over, Cleo said, already dialing. Irene spoke through the closed door, her voice steady, her tone the same one she used to quiet unruly classrooms. Mallory, whatever's in that basket, leave it and go. You're not welcome here. There was silence, and then a quick, defensive laugh. You really think you're some kind of victim in all this, don't you? Jacob's the one who's hurting. You've turned everyone against him. I didn't have to, Irene said. He did that himself. Mallory huffed. He still loves you, you know. He's just lost. Then let him find his own way back, Irene replied. Not through my door. Cleo stepped between them, phone to her ear. Yes, officer, she said crisply. We've got an uninvited guest refusing to leave private property on Missionary Ridge Drive. Yes, elderly resident? Yes, there's a restraining order on file connected to the family. Thank you. Mallory's color drained. You called the police? They'll be here in 5 minutes, Cleo said. I'd suggest you use 4 of them to get in your car. Mallory hesitated, torn between pride and fear, before setting the basket down on the porch rail. This is pathetic, she muttered, heels clicking as she turned toward the steps. You can't stay angry forever. Irene's reply came cool through the door. I don't stay angry, dear. I stay aware. Mallory hesitated, then stalked off toward the curb. The faint slam of her car door echoed down the street, followed by the hiss of tires pulling away. Cleo locked the deadbolt, exhaling. Good riddance. Think she'll try again? Not after the police call her fiancé, Irene said. Jacob won't risk another report. When the patrol car arrived minutes later, the officer, a young man with kind eyes, took notes, confirmed the existing no-contact order, and assured them a follow-up would be filed. Appreciate you letting us know right away, he said. You did the right thing. After he left, Cleo leaned against the counter, shaking her head. You handled that like a general, not a grandma. I've been both, Irene said softly. She opened the front door once more, only long enough to look at the basket sitting forlorn on the porch. Inside were lavender soap, cheap chocolates, and a folded note. Without reading it, she picked up the whole thing, walked to the trash bin beside the steps, and dropped it in. The lid slammed shut with a clean, decisive thud. Cleo raised an eyebrow. Not even gonna peek? No, Irene said. If I open it, it's hers again. The 2 women went back inside. The kettle whistled, filling the quiet with warmth. As Irene poured 2 cups of tea, her phone buzzed. Victor's name lit the screen. I heard about this morning, he said. The police called to confirm. Are you all right? I'm fine, she said, watching the steam rise from her cup. No contact, no damage done. Good, Victor replied. Keep the doors locked. We'll let this incident strengthen the order. Already done, she said. When she hung up, Cleo handed her a cup and sat across the table. The air smelled faintly of lavender, the ghost of the soap Mallory had tried to leave behind. Irene smiled wryly. Even her gifts smell like guilt? Cleo laughed. Lesson 7? Irene nodded, eyes glinting. Never open what's meant to poison you. Outside, the wind picked up again, but this time it sounded like applause against the porch. The next morning brought a chill so sharp it felt like the world had been rinsed clean overnight. Irene rose early, wrapped in her wool robe, and brewed a pot of black coffee instead of tea. The bitterness suited the mood. The porch was still damp from yesterday's rain, the trash bin sealed tight where Mallory's gift lay buried. Irene glanced at it once through the window, then turned away. There was no anger left, only precision. Today was for documentation. She set her papers in a neat stack on the dining table. Bank statements, letters, police reports, and a fresh folder labeled Estate Addendum, Personal Statement. She uncapped her pen, the same silver one Jacob had mocked all those weeks ago, and began to write. To whomever reviews this file, if these papers are being read, understand that every decision within them was made knowingly, willingly, and with full capacity. I have endured ridicule, financial manipulation, and deceit from those who should have been my family. I have no fear of them, nor pity. What remains of my life and assets will serve those who never mocked the trembling hands that built them. Her handwriting was deliberate, measured, not flawless, but steady. Each line felt like a small reclamation. She paused only once, long enough to slide an envelope across the table. It contained 2 printed screenshots, Mallory's deleted video and a copy of the police incident report from the day before. She added a handwritten note beneath them. evidence of intent and character. When she was done, she signed the final line, not with a flourish, but with the quiet grace of completion. By mid-morning, Cleo arrived, a thermos of hot cider in one hand and a stamp kit in the other. "You really don't waste time, do you?" she said, setting everything down. "Time's expensive," Irene replied, "and I've already paid for enough of it." Cleo gave a low whistle as she looked over the pile of paperwork. "You've built a whole fortress of proof." "Not a fortress," Irene corrected, sliding a document toward her. "A record. Fortresses fall. Records stay." Cleo leaned closer, eyes narrowing at the top page. "Personal statement?" "Oh, Irene, this is thorough." "It's necessary," Irene said simply. "Victor will file it with my will. It'll speak for me if anyone ever tries to again." Cleo's gaze softened. "You don't owe them that much thought." "I'm not thinking about them," Irene said, reaching for her pen again. "I'm thinking about what comes next." The two women worked in silence, interrupted only by the sound of paper sliding and the steady tap of Cleo's notary stamp. Each thud felt like a seal against intrusion, another boundary set in ink. When the last document was done, Cleo wiped her brow. "Well, honey, if anyone tries to tangle with this estate, they'll need divine intervention." "That's the point," Irene said, smiling faintly. Cleo leaned back, studying her. No, you look different lately. Not younger, not softer. Just done being afraid." Irene's gaze drifted to the silver pen resting by her cup. "Fear takes energy. I'd rather spend mine making decisions." That afternoon, Victor came by to collect the updated files. He flipped through them with practiced eyes, nodding as he read. "Everything here's in order. You've crossed every T, dotted every I, and then some." "Good," Irene said, "because I want it airtight. No loopholes, not 1 cent for him or anyone tied to him." Victor smiled, but it was tinged with admiration. "You could teach half my clients how to handle their affairs." "I already did," she said. "They just called me Mrs. Whitaker back then." He laughed softly, slipping the folder into his briefcase. "So, where's the money going now?" She didn't hesitate. "The Chattanooga Reading Initiative, the scholarship fund for kids who can't afford books. Every dollar, every interest payment." "That's beautiful," Victor said. "They'll put it to good use." "They will," she said. "Books don't betray you." As Victor packed up, the afternoon sun slanted across the table, glinting off the metal edge of her pen. Irene reached for it and twirled it between her fingers, testing her hand. The tremor was faint, almost imperceptible now. "You've still got the touch," Victor said. She smiled. "Steady when it matters." He closed his case. "I'll file this today, and then you, Mrs. Whitaker, can stop worrying." "Oh, I stopped worrying weeks ago," she said. "Now I just finish what I start." When he left, Irene walked to the window, watching the sunlight stretch long over the ridge. The house was silent again, peaceful, grounded, hers. She placed her pen in its holder, right beside the framed photo of her late husband. For a moment she thought she could almost hear his chuckle, that proud, quiet hum of approval. Then the phone on the counter buzzed once, a new voicemail alert, from a blocked number. She stared at it, unmoving, then pressed delete without listening. The soft beep sounded like the closing of a book. "Lesson 8, she murmured. "You can't threaten what's already free." The room filled with light, bright and unwavering, as Irene turned back to her desk, ready to write whatever came next. The morning sun fell in clean stripes across Irene's writing desk, turning the edges of her papers gold. The house was so quiet she could hear the tick of the kitchen clock through 2 rooms, steady, faithful, patient. She liked that sound. It meant time was still on her side. Everything was ready. the folder Victor had prepared, the notarized statement Cleo had stamped, and a single document waiting for her signature: her final will and testament. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and the faint sweetness of the hyacinths she'd cut from her garden. Irene smoothed the edge of the paper, aligning it perfectly with the blotter before lifting her pen. Her hand hovered for only a moment before settling. The tremor was there, but softer now, as if even her body understood that this was not the time for hesitation. Cleo stood behind her, quiet as a sentry. She'd been there since breakfast, offering tea, calm company, and the occasional bit of gossip to lighten the mood. But now, she said nothing. Irene bent low over the paper, her breath slow, her focus absolute. Each stroke of her name unfurled like a vow. The ink glided smoothly, not a blot or falter in sight. By the time she reached the final letter, the K that completed Whitaker, her hand was utterly still. "There," she said softly, setting the pen down beside the document. Cleo stepped forward, resting a warm hand on her shoulder. "You did it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You finally closed the book." Irene looked at her friend and smiled. Not triumphant, not bitter, just complete. "I didn't close it," she said. "I rewrote it." They both looked down at the signed will. The scholarship fund's name glowed faintly in the morning light, a line of purpose where Jacob's name had once sat. Cleo blinked back sudden tears. "Henry would have been proud." "I know," Irene said. "He always believed in second chances. This one just happens to belong to strangers." Victor arrived an hour later, his briefcase in hand and his expression bright with quiet satisfaction. "Everything looks perfect," he said after scanning the pages. "I'll file it at the courthouse today and have certified copies delivered by the end of the week." He looked up from the desk. "How do you feel?" Irene thought for a moment before answering. "Lighter. Like I've been carrying a name that wasn't mine anymore. And I finally put it down." Victor smiled. "Well, you did it with precision. This version of your will is bulletproof." Cleo snorted. "I'd expect nothing less. I've seen her grade essays. She could catch a comma out of place from across the room." They all laughed, and for a brief moment the heaviness lifted. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt grounded, alive, as though it could finally exhale with her. Victor packed the documents carefully, sliding them into the leather case. "You've built your legacy on your own terms, Irene. That's rare." "It shouldn't be," she replied. "But I suppose that's the lesson I leave behind." By late afternoon, she was alone again. The light had shifted golden, the kind that made everything look softer. The curtains, the photographs, even the scars time had left on the furniture. Her phone rang just as she was putting the kettle on. "Mrs. Whitaker?" came Carmen Ruiz's voice. "I wanted to update you. The investigation into the attempted transfer is complete." Irene steadied the receiver against her ear. "And?" "Jacob's accounts have been frozen," Carmen said. "The authorities traced multiple unauthorized transactions, not just yours. It looks like he'd been using similar access with other clients. There'll be formal charges within the week." Irene closed her eyes for a long moment, the scent of brewing tea filling the silence between them. "Thank you, Carmen. For everything." "You don't have to thank me," Carmen said, "but I'm glad justice finally caught up." After they hung up, Irene poured her tea and carried it to the living room. She sat in her favorite armchair, the one by the window that overlooked the ridge. The air outside was calm, birds threading through sunlight, wind rustling through oak leaves. For the first time in months, the world didn't feel like something to defend against. This was peace. Real peace. Then her phone buzzed again. A text. This time from Cleo. "You might want to see the evening news. Turn on Channel 4. Irene frowned, reached for the remote, and switched on the television. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Local man under investigation for financial fraud. Fiancé reported missing. She froze. The reporter's voice was brisk, professional. Authorities have confirmed that Mallory Burns, fiancé of Jacob Whitaker, has not been seen since Tuesday. Her vehicle was found abandoned near the riverfront. Police are currently interviewing associates of Mr. Whitaker, who has been named in several pending fraud cases. The kettle whistled again from the kitchen, shrill against the sudden quiet. Irene muted the TV. She sat back slowly, the cup of tea cooling in her hands. Mallory. Gone. Not dead, not proven, just gone. The thought should have unsettled her, but instead she felt something stranger, the stillness of inevitability. The truth had a way of finishing its own sentences. She turned her gaze toward the silver pen resting on her desk, the same pen that had written Jacob out of her life, the same one that had rewritten her future. Lesson 9, she whispered. Every name you cross out leaves space for something better. Outside, the sun slipped behind the ridge, flooding the house with a last wave of gold before night came on steady and sure. And for the first time in a long, long while, Irene Whitaker felt entirely, and beautifully, alone. The envelope came on a breeze that smelled of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass. It landed softly in Irene's mailbox among grocery flyers and a church bulletin, its return address printed in elegant blue script. The Chattanooga Reading Initiative. She stood for a moment on the porch, the sun warm on her shoulders, the world unusually quiet. Then she opened it carefully with her letter opener, folding back the paper like it was something sacred. Dear Mrs. Whitaker, your extraordinary generosity has established a new chapter in our program, the Henry and Irene Whitaker Literacy Scholarship. Your gift will provide books, tutors, and opportunities for dozens of local children each year. We are deeply honored to steward your legacy. With gratitude, the board and staff. Chattanooga Reading Initiative. She read it twice, then pressed the paper to her chest. For the first time, her name didn't feel like something she was defending. It felt like something she'd set free. Outside, her garden was in full bloom, a riot of color reclaiming the yard. Iris and peony, wisteria curling around the porch rail like soft purple smoke. She'd nearly forgotten how alive it could look when no one was plotting to take it. Cleo arrived at noon carrying a stack of china teacups and a tin of lemon shortbread. For the teachers, she said, kicking the door shut behind her. I figured we should celebrate the end of your paperwork era. Irene laughed, the sound light and genuine. You mean my revolution. They spent the next hour setting the table on the porch, lace cloth, polished spoons, pots of tea that steamed in the gentle spring air. By 2 o'clock, half a dozen local teachers had arrived, women who'd once shared classrooms, lunchrooms, and long parent conferences with Irene. There was laughter that shook the porch boards, stories about students long grown, and gossip about who'd retired too early or too late. Cleo refilled cups like a benevolent bartender. To Irene, she toasted finally, lifting her teacup. The only person I know who could turn a scandal into a scholarship. The women laughed and clinked their cups. Irene blushed, shaking her head. I just used the tools I had, paper, pen, and patience. And backbone, Cleo added. Don't forget backbone. Irene smiled. I've still got a little left. From the corner of her eye, she caught the garden shimmering in the sunlight, every leaf breathing. For a moment she thought of Jacob, but the thought didn't sting anymore. It felt like remembering a character in a book she'd once closed and shelved. As the teachers began to leave, Carmen Ruiz appeared at the gate, waving with a grin. She wore her bank ID clipped to her blouse and carried a small envelope. I come bearing good news, she said as Irene led her up the porch steps. And a card. From my whole team. She handed over a pale blue envelope, its edges worn from passing through many hands. Inside was a card, covered in signatures and messages. For your strength, for your kindness, you remind us why we do what we do. Irene read it slowly, her chest tightening with something like warmth and disbelief. Carmen, this is too much. Carmen shook her head. You'd be surprised how many of our clients found courage because of you. You might not know it, but you started conversations that needed to happen. Well, Irene said, her voice soft but steady, I suppose teachers never really retire. Carmen smiled. No, ma'am. They just start grading the world instead. They both laughed. An hour later, after everyone had gone, the house fell into its favorite quiet, the kind that hummed with contentment instead of worry. Irene sat on the porch with Cleo, the late light turning everything honey-colored. Victor's car pulled up to the curb. He climbed out, looking crisp even in the heat, his briefcase slung casually over one arm. Afternoon, ladies, he called. I come bearing updates and assurances. Assurances sound like my kind of dessert, Cleo said. Victor chuckled, stepping onto the porch. The case is closed. The estate, protected. Jacob's charges have been filed, and as of this morning, every agency involved has confirmed compliance. You're bulletproof now, Irene. Irene exhaled through a slow smile. That's a new feeling. You've earned it, Victor said, tipping his hat slightly. I'll leave you to your peace. When he drove away, Cleo leaned back in her chair and stretched her legs. Bulletproof, she mused. Not bad for a 78-year-old with a garden and a grudge. Irene laughed, the sound soft and low. Not a grudge, a memory with better boundaries. The two women sat quietly for a while, watching the light fade. A pair of squirrels darted along the porch rail, one chasing the other in a blur of gray and quick joy. Cleo smiled. Even the wildlife knows it's safe here again. Maybe they just know when the wrong people are gone, Irene said, sipping her tea. The air grew cooler, shadows lengthening across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour, echoing off Missionary Ridge. Irene looked around, the home that was finally hers again, the garden blooming, the porch sturdy beneath her feet. Every inch of it untouched, unclaimed, beautifully alive. Lesson 10, she murmured, half to herself. Sometimes victory isn't loud. It's just the sound of nothing left to take. Cleo tilted her head. You think it's over? Irene didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted toward the darkening street beyond the hedge, where the world beyond her gate still hummed with unfinished stories. Finally, she said, I think it's peaceful. And peace is its own kind of ending. She leaned back in her chair, the last of the light brushing her face, the silver pen glinting faintly on the table beside her. But somewhere, faintly, almost beneath the sound of the wind, a single acorn hit the porch rail, rolled and fell into the garden below. It was a small sound, but Irene opened her eyes and smiled. Because she'd learned at last that even endings have echoes. Morning sunlight pooled across Irene's desk, catching the shimmer of dust in the still air. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums with its own heartbeat. The curtains stirred gently in the soft Tennessee wind. Her silver pen, the one that had written her salvation, lay beside a cup of cooling chamomile tea. On the blotter sat a small leather-bound journal. Its spine was worn smooth from decades of notes, memories, and thoughts she never shared aloud. Today, though, she opened to the last blank page. Her hand trembled faintly as she uncapped the pen, but her focus steadied it. The tremor didn't bother her anymore. She'd learned to move with it, not against it. She began to write, her cursive looping neatly across the paper. If you're reading this, then I've already had the piece I worked for. My name is Irene Whitaker, and my story began with the sound of my own pen shaking. I thought that was weakness. It wasn't. It was warning. It told me where the cracks were, and gave me time to fill them. Her hand moved more smoothly as the words flowed. The room seemed to hold its breath. To anyone who's ever been told they're too old, too fragile, too late, I promise you, steadiness is not in the hand. It's in the choice. I didn't get revenge. I got restoration, and that's better. She paused, reread the lines, and smiled. The corners of her eyes softened. Tell Victor I left him the pen, the one that started all this. He'll know why. Tell Carmen to keep watching for hands like mine at the counters. Tell Cleo she's the bravest person I know. And tell anyone who asks that my final act was nothing more than writing a clean ending. She signed it, her name curling like a signature on history itself. Then she folded the page in half, sealed it in an envelope marked for filing, Victor Hayes, attorney at law, and slipped it inside the front pocket of her journal. The leather creaked softly, like approval. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of autumn leaves. It was early fall now, the kind of crisp that made the air taste like renewal. By mid-morning, Cleo appeared on the porch, wrapped in a wool coat and carrying a basket. "Don't tell me you're still working?" she called. "It's too pretty a day for paperwork." Irene smiled from the doorway. "Just finishing a sentence." "Good. Then you've earned these." Cleo held up the basket, triumphant. "Pumpkin muffins. Still warm." They settled on the porch with steaming mugs of cider, the sunlight spilling across the table like honey. The trees along Missionary Ridge burned gold and scarlet, and the wind made the branches shiver, the only trembling Irene noticed anymore. Cleo launched into gossip before Irene could even sip her drink. "Did you hear? They're hiring a new librarian over at the elementary school. Young fella, wears bow ties, apparently allergic to silence." Irene laughed softly. "Sounds like a man in the wrong building." "Exactly what I said." Cleo broke a muffin in half and handed it over. "But they're desperate. You know how hard it is to find someone who actually likes books anymore." "Books don't talk back," Irene said, smiling into her cup. They talked for nearly an hour about small-town politics, neighborhood squirrels, the new preacher at First Methodist. Every story folded neatly into the next until the afternoon sun began to drift low behind the ridge. At one point, Cleo glanced around the porch and sighed. "You ever think about what comes next?" "I used to," Irene said. "Now I just let things end where they should." Cleo reached across the table and gave her hand a squeeze. "You did good, Irene. You really did." "I didn't do good," Irene said softly. "I just stopped letting wrongs stay written." As the sky deepened into late afternoon amber, Cleo packed up her basket and stood. "Same time next week?" "Always," Irene said. When the car pulled away, Irene stayed seated, letting the silence return. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was whole. Through the porch rail, she watched a pair of squirrels chase each other across the lawn, their tiny feet scattering the fallen acorns. Her tea had gone cold, but she didn't mind. The pen beside it gleamed in the dying light, its silver body catching the sun one last time. She picked it up and rolled it between her fingers. The weight felt familiar, loyal. There were no more papers to sign, no names left to erase. But still, she held it like a keepsake from a war she'd survived. She set it gently beside her journal and leaned back in her chair, sweater snug against the chill. The evening air brushed her face, and for the first time in years, her hands rested completely still. Her gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the last slant of light turned everything gold. The house glowed with it. The home they hadn't gotten, the peace they couldn't touch. And with a small, knowing smile, she whispered into the quiet, "My hands may shake, but not when I'm crossing out a name." The line hung in the air like scripture, soft and absolute. Then the wind rose through the garden, rustling the leaves as if the world itself had signed its agreement. A final whispered applause for the woman who'd rewritten her story by hand.